Isn't it strange how a camp gate can creak like a question asking who we choose to be when the cold tests everyone in line? They mocked the trembling POW woman for slowing the morning inspection. Yet the guard with nothing spare felt the rulebook press against him in all the wrong ways. When his only coat brushed her shoulders, even the PX window fell silent, and the dawn caught the wool like a memory someone finally dared to keep. Still, that small choice stayed in the library case, reminding us kindness outlasts the morning. The morning settled over the processing camp in a thin gray wash, the kind that made every sound feel a little softer, a little slower. Steam drifted from the mess tent where the breakfast pots were cooling, and a faint chapel hymn from the service tent floated across the yard like a ribbon of breath. The camp had only been awake for an hour, but the morning inspection line was already full, stretching from the edge of the PX window down toward the Red Cross desk where paperwork would be checked. Most people stood in silence, each clutching a scrap of identity or permission, trying to hold their place in the cold. Elias Ward stood where he had stood every morning for the past several weeks, just left of the PX window boots, planted wide for balance. At 52, he carried the posture of a man used to keeping watch, shoulders steady, gaze quiet. His Red Cross coat, his only one, was folded neatly on the table behind him, still warm from the dryer drums they ran overnight. He kept it close, but out of reach. Regulations said guards weren't supposed to wear anything not issued for the shift. Still, he liked knowing it was there. Across the packed dirt stood a woman who looked as if she might dissolve into the morning light if anyone breathed too hard. She was German, newly processed, her status listed as a former POW now awaiting relocation. Her papers trembled between her fingers as the wind moved through the line. She held the thin sheet, tight knuckles, pale shoulders shaking under a worn shawl, too thin for April cold. People behind her tried not to stare, but it was hard not to. The woman shivering wasn't dramatic. It was the small, stubborn kind that seemed to rise from the bones. Every time the breeze changed direction, her hands twitched and the paper fluttered. She pressed it to her chest, trying to keep herself steady. "Grant?" The inspection supervisor stepped forward and raised his clipboard. "Guard, hold your position. No one moves," he said without looking back. His voice carried the same clipped authority every guard recognized. Rules were rules, and morning inspection had more of them than any other hour in the camp. Elias nodded, but his eyes stayed on the woman. In the rising light, he could see the way she leaned forward ever so slightly, as if bracing herself against something that kept arriving. The hymn from the chapel tent drifted again, just a faint echo now, and it mixed with the soft cough of the mess tent's chimneys. The woman tried to shift her weight almost discreetly. Her ankle wobbled. She steadied herself with a shallow breath. Then another. Elias watched the paper lift and fall with her breathing, each movement lighter than the last, as if her body struggled to keep pace with the cold. Grant paced down the line. "Keep your places. Inspection begins in 3 minutes." The words landed sharply. A few people straightened. No one spoke. Even the wind seemed to listen. Elias glanced at the folded coat behind him, the single warm layer he wasn't allowed to touch during duty. Then he looked back at the woman's hands shaking harder now, and he felt something settle in his chest, heavy and certain. He didn't move, not yet. But the morning felt thinner, the air sharper, and he knew 3 minutes could suddenly feel very long. The line shifted only when the wind forced it to a slow ripple of bodies bracing against the morning chill. The breeze had picked up since dawn, sweeping across the open yard and rattling the metal hinge on the PX window behind Elias. It made a low, irregular creak each time the frame settled, the kind of sound that told you winter hadn't fully given up yet. At the Red Cross desk farther down, a clerk sorted parcels into neat piles, the soft thuds of folded clothing and stamped envelopes dropping into bins as steady as a heartbeat. Elias stood where he'd been assigned, boots firm in the dirt. His fingers brushed the edge of his coat almost without thinking, feeling the coarse wool of the single Red Cross issue he had been given. It was his only one, warm and heavy, meant for evenings off duty. Regulations said he couldn't wear it now. Still, the memory of its warmth moved through him as if his fingertips could recall it on their own. Ahead of him, the German woman, the former POW, tried to steady herself. Her legs were thin beneath the hem of her dress, and the chill had settled into her posture the way frost settles into old window panes. A stronger burst of wind cut through the yard, and she swayed sharply, knees dipping, a small gasp leaving her lips. The paper in her hands bent and snapped back like it wanted to fly away. Maria, who was checking names against her ledger near the front of the line, stepped toward her before she even realized she had moved. But Grant's voice cut in like a snapped branch. "Don't," he warned, eyes narrowing. "No one breaks position, not even you." Maria froze mid-step, shoulders tightening in frustration. She swallowed whatever she'd been about to say and returned to her spot beside the desk. The woman left alone tried to regain her balance. Her breath came out in a shaky cloud, and for a moment she seemed unsure whether she could stay upright at all. The wind pressed through again, sharper this time. The woman bent slightly at the waist, clutching her paper closer to her chest. Her fingers trembled so visibly that even the guards in the back of the line noticed. A few shifted their weight, sympathetic but unwilling to challenge the rules. No one wanted to be the reason an inspection was delayed. Elias felt the pressure of his coat beneath his hand, the weight of it more pronounced with every passing second. The PX window hinge let out another heavy creak. Behind him, a stack of supply crates tapped against one another as the breeze moved around them. Everything seemed to echo the same quiet truth: she was cold, and she wasn't going to last much longer. Grant paced by again, boots making shallow impressions in the dirt. "Hold your positions," he said, as if anyone needed reminding. "Inspection's almost here. No disruptions." Elias lifted his eyes from the coat to the woman. Her shoulders shook with the effort of staying upright. The hem of her shawl fluttered against her legs. She looked like someone trying to stand on a dock during rough tide, bracing against a force that wouldn't let up. He wrapped his fingers around the coat's edge, feeling the urge rise inside him, sharp and insistent. If she fell now, the whole line would halt, papers would scatter, she could get injured. And the rules? Well, the rules weren't warming her. A question brushed the side of his mind, quiet but unshakable. What if she collapsed right in the middle of inspection? The line shifted only when the wind forced it to a slow ripple of bodies bracing against the morning chill. The breeze had picked up since dawn, sweeping across the open yard and rattling the metal hinge on the PX window behind Elias. It made a low, irregular creak each time the frame settled, the kind of sound that told you winter hadn't fully given up yet. At the Red Cross desk farther down, a clerk sorted parcels into neat piles, the soft thuds of folded clothing and stamped envelopes dropping into bins as steady as a heartbeat. Elias stood where he'd been assigned, boots firm in the dirt. His fingers brushed the edge of his coat almost without thinking, feeling the coarse wool of the single Red Cross issue he had been given. It was his only one, warm and heavy, meant for evenings off duty. Regulations said he couldn't wear it now. Still, the memory of its warmth moved through him as if his fingertips could recall it on their own. Ahead of him, the German woman, the former POW, tried to steady herself. Her legs were thin beneath the hem of her dress, and the chill had settled into her posture the way frost settles into old window panes. A stronger burst of wind cut through the yard, and she swayed sharply, knees dipping, a small gasp leaving her lips. The paper in her hands bent and snapped back like it wanted to fly away. Maria, who was checking names against her ledger near the front of the line, stepped toward her before she even realized she had moved. But Grant's voice cut in like a snapped branch. "Don't," he warned, eyes narrowing. "No one breaks position, not even you." Maria froze mid-step, shoulders tightening in frustration. She swallowed whatever she'd been about to say and returned to her spot beside the desk. The woman left alone tried to regain her balance. Her breath came out in a shaky cloud, and for a moment she seemed unsure whether she could stay upright at all. The wind pressed through again, sharper this time. The woman bent slightly at the waist, clutching her paper closer to her chest. Her fingers trembled so visibly that even the guards in the back of the line noticed. A few shifted their weight, sympathetic but unwilling to challenge the rules. No one wanted to be the reason an inspection was delayed. Elias felt the pressure of his coat beneath his hand, the weight of it more pronounced with every passing second. The PX window hinge let out another heavy creak. Behind him, a stack of supply crates tapped against one another as the breeze moved around them. Everything seemed to echo the same quiet truth: she was cold, and she wasn't going to last much longer. Grant paced by again, boots making shallow impressions in the dirt. "Hold your positions," he said, as if anyone needed reminding. "Inspection's almost here. No disruptions." Elias lifted his eyes from the coat to the woman. Her shoulders shook with the effort of staying upright. The hem of her shawl fluttered against her legs. She looked like someone trying to stand on a dock during rough tide, bracing against a force that wouldn't let up. He wrapped his fingers around the coat's edge, feeling the urge rise inside him sharp and insistent. If she fell now, the whole line would halt, papers would scatter, she could get injured. And the rules weren't warming her. A question brushed the side of his mind, quiet but unshakable. What if she collapsed right in the middle of inspection? The yard had grown quieter as the sun climbed a little higher, the pale light stretching across the gravel like a thin sheet pulled tight. Somewhere near the chapel tent, a loose pass fluttered across the ground and caught against a crate. Moments later, a short, sharp whistle sounded from the direction of the headquarters tent, a signal that inspection officers would be arriving soon. Grant snapped open his clipboard, the wood making a crisp crack that cut through the stillness. People shifted just enough to show they had heard, but not enough to move from their positions. The line had the tense structure of something barely holding together. Elias stood at his post, his hand tightening around the folded Red Cross coat resting behind him. The wool brushed against his knuckles, familiar and insistent. Ahead, the former POW woman tried again to brace herself. Her legs trembled as if the cold had seeped bone deep. When she attempted to straighten, her knees buckled. She gasped softly and dropped to one knee, her free hand clutching the edge of a wooden support stake hammered into the ground. The paper in her other hand nearly slipped from her fingers. Maria noticed immediately. She stepped forward, eyes wide. "Elias," she called, voice low but urgent. "She's not going to make it." Grant spun around, his expression hardening. "Hold your place, Maria," he warned, raising his clipboard as if to block her path. "Nobody moves until inspection begins, not a single step." Maria's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. The woman in front of her wavered again, shoulders folding inward as she tried to pull herself upright. She couldn't. The cold had taken whatever strength she'd been holding on to. Grant's boots struck the dirt with sharper rhythm now. He stopped directly in front of the woman, but instead of helping her, he turned to Elias. "Guard," his voice cracked through the air. "Stand down. Do not leave your position." Elias felt the words hit him like a gate clanging shut. He looked from Grant to the woman struggling in front of him. She tried to rise again, her fingers slipping on the wood. The movement was so small it might have gone unnoticed, but it landed with the weight of something irreversible. He looked down the line. Some eyes were on him, some on the woman. All of them carried the same mixture of worry and resignation. They wouldn't move. They couldn't. The rules were the rules, and the morning's order depended on them. But the rule wasn't saving her. Elias drew in a breath that felt colder than the air around him. The coat behind him seemed to press at his back like a memory insisting itself onto the present moment. He felt the wool under his fingertips again, and in that texture was a choice he had been trying not to make. Grant barked another reminder. "Guard. You will stay where you are." Elias didn't answer. The woman's shoulders sagged. Her head dipped forward. She let out a faint, tired sound as if bracing for the ground to take her completely. Elias stepped forward. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was a simple, deliberate motion that broke the stillness of the line. Gravel shifted under his boot, and the air seemed to change shape around him. A few people inhaled sharply. Maria clasped her ledger to her chest. He walked out of position. The canvas walls of the nearby supply tent stirred in the rising breeze, their flaps lifting and falling with a soft thud each time the wind passed through. From the chapel tent, behind the rows of crates, the last notes of a morning hymn faded into silence, replaced by the uneven rattle of the PX window clattering against its frame. The yard, once tense and expectant, now felt like it was holding its breath. Elias moved toward the woman slowly, but with a certainty that left no room for hesitation. The gravel pressed under his boots, loose stones shifting just enough to echo in the quiet. When he reached her, she was still on one knee, her breath thin, her fingers trembling around the wooden stake she clutched for balance. He lowered himself beside her, letting one knee meet the cold ground. "Let me help you," he said gently. She didn't respond in words, only lifted her eyes toward him, tired, frightened, and grateful all at once. He placed a steady hand beneath her elbow and guided her upward, easing her weight so she wouldn't have to fight gravity alone. When she finally stood, she swayed again, and Elias instinctively shifted closer to keep her upright. Behind him on the PX table lay the Red Cross coat, the only coat he owned. He reached back without looking and pulled it into his arms. The wool carried the clean, faint scent of soap from last night's wash cycle. It was a small comfort, but it was warmth, and she had none. He unfolded it carefully, almost reverently, and lifted it toward her shoulders. "This is yours for now," he murmured. The woman blinked in surprise. Her breath shook as it left her, and when the coat settled across her back, she let out a soft, broken sound, half relief, half disbelief. Tears gathered quickly, but not from fear. It was the kind of trembling that came when someone who expected nothing suddenly received something gentle. She pressed her fingers to the wool as if confirming it was real. The warmth began to reach her hands first, and then her shoulders, and then the thin fabric of her dress. Elias steadied her again when her knees dipped. "You're all right," he said quietly. Grant approached at a fast, bristling pace, the clipboard tucked tightly under his arm. "Guard," he snapped, voice rising. "You will be written up for abandoning your post. You know that." Elias turned to face him, the woman still leaning lightly against his arm. "If I kept the coat?" He answered she would shake through the entire inspection. Grant opened his mouth to reply, then stopped. A few others in line watched with cautious, unspoken approval, their faces unreadable but attentive. The wind moved between them, scattering dust along the path, as if urging everything forward. The woman shifted her weight and steadied herself with the help of Elias's arm. Her cheek brushed the edge of the coat's collar. It was already warming beneath her touch. The canvas flap behind them cracked again in the wind. The PX window clattered once more, louder this time, as though the whole camp had turned to look. Grant exhaled sharply through his nose, adjusting the clipboard to hide the flicker of uncertainty on his face. "Inspection will see this," he said. The words hung in the cold morning air, heavy enough to bend everything around them. The mess hall ladle clanged softly in the distance as breakfast cleanup wrapped up its metallic rhythm, drifting over the camp like a slow reminder that the morning was moving on. Pages rustled under Grant's hand as he sorted through the stack of reports he had gathered from the inspection staff. From the chapel tent, the subdued hum of the choir warming up for midday service rose and fell, giving the yard a steadier pulse than it had earlier. Elias stood beside the inspection table, his posture quiet but grounded. The Red Cross coat he had given away hung neatly on a hook near the corner, still carrying the faint shape of the woman's shoulders. The wool looked warmer now, as though it remembered the weight it had held. Grant flipped the clipboard over, thumb tracing down the entry he had written only minutes before. His expression was unreadable at first, but his eyes lingered longer than usual on one line. "Guard Elias Ward," he read under his breath, "gave his only coat to a German POW woman before inspection." The words sat heavily in the still air. A few soldiers nearby paused their conversations and looked over. None spoke, but two exchanged a brief glance before giving Elias a small nod, quiet, almost unnoticeable, but full of meaning. They had seen what he did. They understood why he had done it. Maria approached from the side, carrying the last of the paperwork. She placed the forms down and folded her hands, watching Grant with a steady gaze. Grant clicked the pen on his clipboard and inhaled sharply, as though preparing to deliver the reprimand the handbook demanded. But the breath left him slower than it came. His shoulders shifted, tension rising and falling in a single motion. He tore the violation page straight down the center. "Today," he said, voice lower, "no one gets written up." The sound of the paper ripping was soft, yet it carried across the space like a verdict. A few more soldiers looked up. Elias didn't move. He merely met Grant's gaze, calm and unflinching. Grant set the torn pieces aside and closed the clipboard, the wooden cover making a muted thud. He didn't offer praise, but he didn't need to. His decision stood on its own. Maria stepped closer to Elias and lowered her voice. "Not everyone would give up the only thing they had," she said. There was no judgment in her tone, only a kind of admiration she didn't try to hide. Elias looked toward the hook where the coat hung. The wool swayed gently when a breeze moved through, as though acknowledging its own unexpected journey that morning. People began to disperse in small knots, returning to their duties. The inspection tents opened again, and the rest of the reports were filed without delay. Life in the camp resumed its usual rhythm, but something in the air felt changed, subtle, softer, like a corner of the world had shifted just a little toward warmth. Grant gathered the remaining papers and straightened them with the edge of his palm. He hesitated for just a second, glancing again at the coat on the hook. "That coat," he said quietly, mostly to himself, "won't be forgotten." The words drifted out into the cool air, as steady as the choir's hum. The camp library was quiet at midday, lit mostly by the soft amber glow of two standing lamps near the back wall. Their low hum blended with the rustle of a page turning somewhere in the reading area, and a single sustained chord drifted in from the chapel next door as the organist warmed up for afternoon practice. It gave the room a gentle stillness, as if the building itself knew it was meant to hold memories carefully. Along the far wall stood a glass display case. Inside it, arranged with a kind of respectful precision, sat the Red Cross coat that had once belonged to Elias Ward. The wool looked slightly worn at the cuffs, but it had been cleaned, brushed, and folded with deliberate care. Above the fold, pinned neatly, was the small PX chit Elias had once carried in his pocket, and beneath both items lay a card printed in clean, even lettering, given by an American guard to a German POW woman during the morning inspection spring 1945. The label didn't mention the cold wind or the moment her knees buckled. It didn't mention the rules he stepped past or the stare Grant gave him or the quiet nods of the other soldiers. It said only what mattered, that in a morning full of regulations and routine, one guard had offered the only coat he had to someone who couldn't stand on her own. Footsteps moved softly through the room. A former prisoner, older now, shoulders slightly stooped, walked past the case. He paused when he saw the coat, leaning in, as though recognizing a long-forgotten part of his own story. He placed his hand gently on the glass fingertips resting there for a moment that stretched longer than the space around it. It wasn't loud, it wasn't grand, but it carried the weight of a thanks too deep for words. Elias stood a few steps behind him, having arrived quietly through the side entrance. He wasn't wearing a uniform now, just a simple shirt and the same steady expression he'd carried through most of his life. He waited until the man stepped away before moving closer to the display. He looked at the coat for a long time. The library was still around him, a small sanctuary tucked between the chapel and the mess hall. The lamplight made the red cross on the sleeve glow faintly, as if warmed from within. Elias let his eyes trace the familiar wool, the shoulder seams, the place where the fabric had once rested against his own neck before it rested on hers. He didn't touch the glass. He didn't need to. He simply nodded, quiet, steady, the kind of acknowledgement made by someone who never wanted recognition to begin with. A small breath left him, neither heavy nor light, just real. He stepped back, letting the memory settle where it belonged. The lamps hummed again. A page turned somewhere deeper in the library. The chapel's chord rose once more, fuller this time, then drifted away. Elias took one last look at the coat, at the PX chit, at the simple card naming the moment for what it was. Some things he thought didn't need retelling to stay alive. And as he walked toward the door, the truth of it followed him gently. There are things no one needs to say, yet no one forgets. The library stayed hushed as the lamp hummed above the glass case, its warm light settling over the folded Red Cross coat and the small PX chit resting beside it, the same items that once warmed a trembling German POW woman during morning inspection. People came and went through the quiet aisle, and every so often someone paused to look inside, reminded that kindness rarely arrives with ceremony. It arrives the way a canteen cup catches a stripe of morning light and makes something simple feel worth keeping. Elias stood there longer than he planned, thinking how one small choice can echo far past the moment it's made, even when the rulebook insists otherwise and the world barely notices. And as he turned to leave, the plaque beneath the coat seemed to breathe with him, whispering that some acts don't need retelling, only remembering.